Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner, Cathy Gillespie, with Toba Kaplan and Cara Chapman.
Hi.
Hello.
All righty, so we talk at Constitutional Chat about the hot issue of the week, or a hot issue in general, with a constitutional expert. And today, our hot topic, which by the way, our students picked, Tova and Dakare, is Abraham Lincoln's address at Cooper Union. Fascinating address, by the way. And our constitutional expert is James D. Best. Say hello, Mr. Best.
Hello, everybody.
All right, I'm going to talk about, I'm an actress by trade, but I founded Constituting America in 2010 with Cathy Gillespie, and I'm the co-president with Cathy Gillespie. We like to say it takes a left wing and a right wing to fly, and Cathy and I are the wings of this organization with so many other people and the donors that make our foundation work, the engine behind our foundation. And we are a multi-tiered foundation. We have programs for students where there's a fantastic contest. We have a 90-day study for adults, which is what we're talking about today. It's in session right now, the 90-day study. We have a speaking program, the George Washington Speaking Initiative. We've given over 500 speeches into the classroom, and now we're doing live Zooms during the pandemic. If you'd like to join us or have a speak at your school, please go to constitutingamerica.org. We have lots of wonderful programs. We're thrilled you're here. And also I want to introduce Cathy Gillespie. Cathy Gillespie is the co-president of Constituting America and one of the 16 private citizens serving on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, helping organize the celebration of our country's 250th birthday in 2026. Everyone say semi-quincentennial. All right, it's a very prestigious organization, and we're glad that she's a part of that. And we're so thrilled to have with us Toba Kaplan. Toba Kaplan is 16 years old and lives in Illinois. She currently serves as the National Youth Director for Constituting America. My daughter was the first. So Tova is just fantastic. The torch was handed to Tova. She runs the National Youth Advisory Council, better than most adults. She's a 3-time winner of the We the Future contest. That's Constituting America's contest. She won. She's a right brain and a left brain. Listen to this. In the entrepreneurial category, where she created a marketing plan. Then she won in the public service announcement. She filmed a commercial. And she won in that category. And then she won for STEM, where she created an app. So she's so brilliant and talented. And she's passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. So say hello, Tova.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Glad to be here.
Now, Dakare Chatman is our Constituting America student ambassador. He is 16 years old as well and is currently a junior full-time college student in South Carolina. I don't know how that works, but he's a junior in high school and a full-time college student at the same time. He's won Constituting America's We the Future contest twice, once for Best PSA, where he reminds viewers the Constitution is an American thing, so know it. We have billboards with his face all over the country too, saying just that. And he also won for short film, Man on the Street, which you can see at Constituting America. He is also actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board. I would say Tova and Dakare are the cornerstones of our Youth Advisory Board. He's a working actor, seen most recently on HBO's The Righteous Gemstones and in Netflix Outer Banks, which is just out this week. It's on Netflix, so check it out. Dakare wishes to be an actor, but also a politician, and he says you must be an actor to be a politician. Say hello, Dakare.
Hello, thank you guys for being here. I'm so glad to be here, and I hope you learned something tonight.
Oh, we all will. It'll be fantastic. Now, our special guest, James D. Best. James D. Best is the author of many books, including the best-selling Steve Dancy Tales and our favorite, Tempest at Dawn. Everyone should get this book. Tempest at Dawn, a classic novelization of the Constitutional Convention. And he happens to donate very generously a copy of this book every year to our auction. We have numerous auctions, silent auctions throughout the year. and he donates his book every year to Constituting America auction, so we thank him for that. Mr. Best is also the author of The Shut Mouth Society, a modern-day fiction thriller based on the discovery of a secret historical Abraham Lincoln document. Cool. Run, don't walk to get that. I first met Mr. Best on the set of Glenn Beck and Fox back in June of 2010. So 10 years we've known each other, and he has written more than 27 essays for our Constituting America 90-day study, which once again is at constitutingamerica.org. In addition to being a best-selling author, Mr. Best is a sought-after speaker and enjoys film, surfing, skiing, and watching his grandchildren. Mr. Best splits his time between Omaha, Nebraska, San Diego, and New York City. Welcome, Mr. Best.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
Oh, it's good to be here.
You're in Nebraska right now, and I'm looking at your awesome leopard chair, and I just think it's really cool. Well, we're thrilled to have you here, and thank you for all the wonderful works that you do for Constituting America. And everyone should run, don't walk to buy Mr. Best's books. Okay, so we are going to jump right into the Cooper Union Address. Oh, I do want to tell everyone about our 90-day study. Listen to the things. If you want to go to Constituting America, you can actually check out all these are archived. In 2010, we did the relevancy of the Federalist Papers. 2011, the Constitution. 2010, the amendments to the Constitution. We know they're a part of the Constitution, but we broke them apart. It's a fascinating study. 2013, the classics that inspired the Constitution and the challenges it faces today. In 2015, executive branch overreach. In 2016, the intrigue of presidential elections and their constitutional impact. 2017, the Supreme Court. 2018, the Congress. And 2019, the states. Look at all these fabulous studies. And now 2020, the one we're currently doing is the important dates in American history. Okay, now the Cooper Union Address. Mr. Best, you wrote a fabulous essay. His essay is up now at constitutingamerica.org. You can see Mr. Best's fabulous study talking about this Cooper Union Address of Abraham Lincoln's. You know, I read it. I had this very small print and highlighted and all kinds of things circled. You know, I think what people don't know about the Cooper Union Address, Mr. Best, is that Abraham Lincoln was sort of a nobody still a little bit. He'd done the debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He hadn't won any elections. He was part of this sprouting brand new Republican Party. And he shows up to do this address, gets his photo taken, and after this address, he becomes the rage. I mean, everyone is the standing ovations, and they love him. But what he does in this address is he really points out the fact that the founders really, and he talks about the 39, and then he gives specific 39 framers who signed the Constitution. And then he narrows it down to 21 because some voted more than once, but how they did not want slavery to procreate in the United States, in the Northwestern territories. They all voted, these 21, to not expand slavery into the 21 states. And the argument that Lincoln makes is that in the Constitution in general, founding fathers did not want this. So I'm setting it up for you to elaborate a little bit. Talk to us about what strikes you the most relevant and is the most interesting aspect of this Cooper Union Address.
Well, it was a very carefully crafted speech, and no one was expecting much. His reputation from the Lincoln-Douglas debates was as a storyteller, and so that was what they were kind of expecting. And there were three sections to the speech. The first section, he was talking almost directly back to Stephen Douglas. And Douglas had written a paper that was in the, let's see, I think it was Harper's Weekly, where he said that the founding fathers did not believe that the federal government had the right to obstruct slavery in the territories. And so the first third of the speech, or actually more than a third, is he went through all the founding fathers, and it was a constitutional presentation where he went into the people who had actually written it and how they voted before and after, and showed that they did not agree with Stephen Douglas, who was kind of his nemesis. I mean, he ran against him in the Senate. Lincoln wanted to run for president. He thought that Stephen Douglas would be the candidate, and so he was taking him on in the preliminary speech. Second part of the speech, he was speaking to the southern states and the slaveholding states, and he pretty much directly addressed the politics of the day on the issue. And then the third section of the speech was the only part I put in my essay. He was speaking to the Republican Party itself, and this was a Republican men's club that was putting on this series of seminars of candidates for president. And so he was talking to the choir in the third part of the speech, and it was pretty much a rallying cry to stick with their principles and to follow their principles and the founding principles in the coming election.
Yes, you did. Dakare, do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Best. So I actually kind of formulated my questions before we started, but looking, back on this wonderful speech, the biggest question that arises to me that sets this up is, why did the address have such an impact? Like, as Janine said, he was kind of like a nobody, and I was kind of doing a little bit of research and digging, and I'm thinking, so like, do you think it's because the Northerners were so concerned about slavery, or was it just that he had this great reputation that was big enough to get them to love him?
Well, first, I don't think he had a good reputation in New York. He was just considered a minor politician in Illinois. So that certainly wasn't one of the elements that made this such a successful speech. But I think he hit all the issues of the day, and it doesn't come across if you just read it. But Lincoln was a very animated speaker, and he was probably one of the best speech makers in our country's history. And he knew how to control an audience, how to read an audience. And what he did was in a lot of repetition, and he would actually imitate the speaking pattern of Douglas and make fun of him and get people laughing and stuff. And then there was a lot of repetition in the speech. And every time he repeated it, he would repeat it in a tone of voice that would kind of elicit laughter from the crowd and stuff. So he knew how to work an audience. And if you look at all of his speeches, from the Gettysburg Address, the House Divided speech, and this one, he always tailored his speech to the audience and to the event. And so he just was very good at what he did. And then I think a lot of why he was so successful in this speech was they just underestimated him, and he just went way over their expectations.
Yes, and the way he structured it, you mentioned this. What's interesting to me, because I do a lot of speaking engagements as well, is that he was talking not really to the audience for the majority of it, 2/3 of it, as you were saying. He was actually speaking to, and whatever they, the Confederacy, the pro-slavery states, Stephen Douglas, he was speaking to them, which I thought was really unique. Usually speakers just speak to the crowd, and the crowd usually is on his side, or he's trying to convince the crowd that's right there. And instead, it's like as if he were speaking into a camera to these people that weren't even there. I thought that was a really unique way of doing it, as well as setting up all these founding fathers who actually signed and Washington signed the bill into law, because he named all the men who had signed the Constitution who still went on to sign this Northwestern Territory restriction of slavery they could not have slavery there. He really, two pages, 2.5 pages, he sets that up to make his point.
Well, one of the things that most people don't know is when this speech was over, he was taken to dinner by the men's club. And at about midnight, he wandered across the street and he went to the Tribune. And he sat there with the Tribune reporter, and he went through the entire speech and made sure that it was reflected properly in the newspaper. And so he wanted this speech. This is New York, even back then, was the media capital of the world. And the Tribune, which was owned by Horace Greeley, was the #1 newspaper in the country. And he made sure that his speech was reflected exactly the way he wanted it. So when he was speaking to Stephen Douglas or the southern states, he knew in advance that he was going to do this and that they would get the message through the newspapers.
Okay, so Tova, what's your question?
Okay, so first of all, this is really interesting. Thank you for being with us. I was reading through the speech earlier, and I noticed that, like, Abraham Lincoln talks a lot about how he's trying to dissociate the Republican Party with, like, violence. So he talks about separating the Republican Party from, like, the incident with John Brown at Harper's Ferry. He's, like, trying to make this strong distinction that that was not Republicans that were responsible for that. You know, John Brown was not a Republican. But then, obviously, Lincoln is most well known for spearheading a very bloody Civil War that had a lot of violence. So I was wondering, I guess this is talking more generally about Lincoln, but could you talk more about the development of his character that led him from, in this speech, being really against violence, trying to say, no, we are not the party of violence or war, we're not trying to start slave insurrections, to where he later on, where he's more famously spearheading this war?
Wow, that's a tough question. First off, with Harper's Ferry, the Democrats were trying to tar the Republicans with the responsibility for that uprising, and he was deflecting that, essentially. I think that when he became president, he flailed a lot in the early years of the war, and went through a lot of generals, and finally found Grant and somebody who could win for him. I don't think he wanted to go to war. I think he would have welcomed any other alternative. But once he was, the war, well, actually they succeeded before he even took the inauguration. So I think that he was kind of riding the times. I mean, he wasn't directing them as much as he was trying to manage his way through them. And it was a learning process. He was not what you would call a really good war president in the initial stages, but he grew to be exceptionally good at it. But he was good at keeping the normal citizens and the country behind him. And even through all this, he won re-election.
You know, Mr. Best, it's interesting. I circled this, and Tova, I think it relates to your question. He was talking about, once again, the territories, but what I don't know what they called Stephen Douglas and his, what were they called at that point, Mr. Best? Were they called they weren't called the Confederacy yet. What term should we use for this body of people that wanted to keep slavery? Is there a term? No, we don't know yet. Okay.
Yeah, we know, but they were.
Okay. Well, anyway, so this I thought was really interesting. This is what the Senator Douglas was insisting upon, Tova. I think this is what these natural and apparently adequate means of failing, what will convince them? This and this only. So in other words, this is what Stephen Douglas and their people were wanting. Cease to call slavery slave. This is what they wanted the Republicans to do. This is what they wanted the Union to do. So it was all or nothing with the South. And so he's saying, they said that the South insisted that the Union and Lincoln and the Republican Party cease to call slavery wrong and join them in calling it right. These are Abraham Lincoln's words in the speech. And this must be done thoroughly, done in acts as well as in words. Silence will not be tolerated. We must place ourselves avowedly with them. Senator Douglas's new sedition law must be enacted and enforced, suppressing all declarations that slavery is wrong, whether made in politics, in presses, in pulpits, or in private. So everywhere, everyone was just supposed to say, never say that slavery was wrong. We must attest and return their fugitive slaves with greedy pleasure. We must pull down our free state constitutions. The whole atmosphere must be disinfected from all taint of opposition to slavery before they will cease to believe that all their troubles proceed from us. So I think that that kind of sets up the position that Lincoln was in. What do you think, Mr. Best?
I think that exactly defines where he was and what his thought processes were. It also probably, the Republican Party itself was an abolitionist party formed that way. And so when he won election, I think that's why the state succeeded even before he took the inauguration, is because they could read as well. The Cooper Union Address had been published widely throughout the United States, and so he knew what was coming, and they were in disagreement. And but yeah, he was saying it was an all or nothing kind of situation, which wasn't that far from his House Divided speech, which he gave when he was first nominated to be senator. Or he wasn't nominated as senator, when he was nominated to run for Senate, which he lost to Douglas. Both of them, by the way, were Illinois politicians. Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln were both from Illinois.
Oh, so there you go, Tova, since you're in Illinois. Cathy, what's your question? I'll come back to you, Dakare. Let me just run to Cathy. Go ahead, Cathy.
Well, I just thought it might be helpful if we could back up for a second, because I know in your essay you say the Republican Party was new, and you just made the point that the Republican Party was established as an abolitionist party. Could you talk just for a second about sort of the history and how the Republican Party was founded? Because I think it had just been founded maybe a few years before Lincoln's speech, and it might just help the audience to understand a little bit more where he was coming from.
Yeah, the main opponent party prior to the Republicans was the Whigs, and they kind of fell into secession. This was a very tough period in the nation's history. There were 8 presidents before Lincoln who served one term. 8 in a row, only served a single term. And so the Republicans formed in about, I think it was about 1850, but they ran Fremont in 1856, and he lost. But they tried as a brand new party to run basically a celebrity, because Fremont was a big hero at the time, and lost that election. And then in the next election, the favorite was Seward, who became Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State eventually. But most of the people who were in Cooper Union were Seward loyalists, or not loyalists, but proponents or fans. And so Lincoln was in a hostile environment from a standpoint of within the Republican Party, and he won them over with this speech.
Well, so describe, I don't think I understand the Cooper Union aspect of this. What was Cooper Union?
Cooper Union was there was a Republicans men's club in New York City, and they formed in fact, during that period of time in their history, entertainment were these kind of speeches. So a lot of famous poets and writers made more of their money from going around speaking than they did from their work. And so this was, I mean, there wasn't television or movies, so people went and heard speakers. And so this Republican Men's Club, and by the way, New York was a Democratic city, so they were a minority within the electorate at that time in the city. but they were active, and they formed this seminar where they invited all of the Republican candidates, and I think there were about 8 to speak, and I think they spoke about a week apart.
So what was Cooper Union then?
Cooper Union was just a, still there, still in New York, and it was kind of a theater is all. It was actually a school. It was a school, and it was a auditorium in the school.
Oh, so Cooper Union was a place.
It was a place.
Okay,
It's,
okay. You never learn unless you ask.
Yeah.
Cooper,
I should have made that. I should have made that clear earlier.
Yeah. But the Republican Party was founded, where? Wasn't it like Wisconsin or something? And it was specifically founded to stop slavery.
Yes, correct.
Right?
I'm
And
not sure about.
Midwestern. Where was it? The very first. I've seen a picture of the actual building.
I don't know the exact place it was formed, but I do know it was in the Midwest.
Somewhere in the Midwest. I've seen the little building where they started it. But it was. A lot of people don't know that it was the actual party was founded to abolish slavery. Okay, Tova, go ahead.
Okay, so we were talking about the founding of the Republican Party and kind of Lincoln's identity in that party as kind of an outsider, as you were mentioning. But I was wondering, in terms of Lincoln's ideology and political views, how in line were his political views with those of the Republican Party? Like, were his views exactly in line with the new Republican Party? Was he more moderate, more radical? Like, where was he on that scale?
Well, you have tough questions.
I try.
Yeah. Well, first off, Lincoln's law partner called him the most closed-mouthed man he ever met or had ever encountered. And he said that Lincoln did not reveal his thinking behind what he did. And he was perceived, even during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, as a moderate. He never was they were radical. They actually were called radical Republicans, and they wanted abolition. And all Lincoln was after was not having slavery spread any further. Except, I think that, like all politicians, he went as far as he thought he could go and still be elected. So he didn't want to be identified on the fringe and be an absolute abolitionist, but he was, and the speech was all about not expanding slavery to any more states. And the general consensus at that time was if it didn't expand to other states, and then those, or territories in those states, when they became states, they would get 2 senators, and eventually the Senate would tip, and then they would be able to outlaw slavery. So that's why the South was so much against the states coming in and wanted slavery and still in the territories even before they became a state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Hey, Dakare, 1 second. I want to check on, continuing this process that he did not want slavery expanding into other states, but neither did so many of the founders, the founding fathers, or those who signed the United States Constitution, because there's a whole debate about whether the Constitution said in this regard, in regard to slavery, where the federal government has the say over slavery, and if it exists or doesn't exist, or if the states have the say. And I think that this is really the basis of the whole speech, where he's saying all the founding fathers believed it was the federal government's responsibility to, and they were the ones who could say whether there was going to be slavery or not slavery. And he sets this up by talking about the 39 signers of the Constitution and then the 21, but all of them who signed this bill and who did not want slavery to be expanded. And in that point, he was saying the federal government has the right to say whether slavery did or didn't exist, or did expand or didn't exist. And he lists all these original founding fathers, like Rufus King, I'm looking for a name, James Madison. They all signed, well, I don't know if they were part of the 39, But when he gets to the 21, he has Rufus King, all these things, but also Washington signed it. He didn't want it to expand. So, so many of these 21, which he said was a majority of the founding fathers that signed the Constitution, 21 of them, which was a majority, said the federal government has the right to say that the federal government is the one to say whether there's going to be slavery or not. And they also signed saying that slavery should not extend into other territories. So he was really correlating, which was Tova and Dakare were talking about this when we were thinking about what topic we wanted, that really one of the thrust of this was just that the federal government was the one they believed should make these decisions, kind of like the pandemic right now. Is this the federal government's responsibility or the state's responsibility? But they believe the federal government was the one to be responsible for whether slavery exists or not, or went into other states or not. Whereas Stephen Douglas and his group thought the states should have the say. So one last thing, it's really interesting here what Washington said. First of all, Jefferson said about Virginia, Abraham Lincoln says this in the speech, "It is still in our power to direct the process of emancipation and deportation peaceably and in slow degrees, as that the evil will wear off insensibly and their places be, pari passu, I don't know how you say that, filled up with free white laborers. If, on the contrary, it is left to force itself on, human nature must shudder at the prospect held up." So he was wanting to get rid of slavery. Of course, he was talking about Virginia at that point. But then Washington, it's the last thing I'm going to point out here, Washington said something to Lafayette. Where is that? Hang on, I'm going to find it. Where is the Washington Lafayette? Here it is. Washington said to Lafayette, and this was in Abraham Lincoln's speech, he wrote Lafayette that he considered that prohibition a wise measure, expressing the same connection, his hope that we should at some time have a confederacy of free states. So, you know, they really makes the point that the founding fathers really wanted slavery to go away.
Yes, and at the time of the first Congress, the only territories that existed in the United States was the Northwest Territory. And in the Northwest Ordinance, it says slavery is not allowed. And they all voted on that.
Exactly. And that's what he takes about 2 pages. Dakare, what would you like to say?
Yes, Mr. Best. So in reading, I just want to pull. So in reading the speech, Lincoln says, "And now if they would listen, as I suppose they will not, I would address a few words to the Southern people." Why would he address the Southern people is my question. What was that purpose, I guess,
Well, first, he wanted it in the papers, and he really was addressing the slaveholding states. And I think to a degree what was happening at that point in time was the Democrat Party was splitting in two. And Stephen Douglas was one of the faction leaders, the Democrats that were in the northern states. And if you want my honest opinion, I think Lincoln was egging on that split of the Democratic Party, because it's the only way the Republicans could actually win the election was if the Democrats split, and they did. And he did not have a majority of the popular vote either when he was elected.
Cathy, you're muted.
Yeah, no,
There we go.
I have a question. When I was reading this speech, there was a part that I just didn't really understand, and that was when President Lincoln said, or he wasn't president when he said it, but he said, "You say we are sectional. We deny it. That makes an issue, and the burden of proof is upon you." And then he goes on to talk later, a couple of paragraphs down, he talks about George Washington's farewell address, where Washington warned against parties, against parties going for parties and over your country maybe. But what is this meaning of sectional? I don't really understand that.
In the 1856 election, there were no Republicans who voted in the South. The slaveholding states, there were none. So they were saying, you're not a national party. You're just a sectional party.
Oh, okay. Just like a regional party.
Right.
Maybe. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Lincoln came back, I think he said something like, well, if that's your criteria, then wait till the next election and we'll have some votes down there. And then you'll have to recognize us as a national party.
Okay.
Fascinating. Tova.
Okay, so you were, Mr. Best, you were talking earlier about, which I found really interesting, about how Lincoln, after his speech, went to the media to make sure they got it right. And as we know, as I'm sure you know, looking through history, some of our best and most prominent presidents have really utilized the popular media and like the popular culture to spread their message, like really savvy. So how did Lincoln utilize the popular media at the time and popular culture in order to spread his message?
Well, first off, he wrote this speech to be read, and that was a trick that he had. He had a way of writing a speech that could be read and make sense, but when he delivered it in a manner that was a little bit different than just a reading of it would do. So one was getting it read. The second, and probably I hope I can segue into this all right, the same day, he went and had his picture taken. Boy, I just went blank on me. Anyways, he had his photograph taken, and that photograph was the first photograph ever used as a political prop. Campaign prop, and it was in newspapers and magazines. I think it was on the cover of Harper's Weekly. So he had this photograph taken, and in the afternoon, just before the speech, in this new suit that he paid $100 for, a lot of money back then, just so he could get this picture. Matthew Brady, I'm sorry, my mind went blank. So Matthew Brady took this. And Matthew Brady also took a picture of Stephen Douglas just before, and he was called a little giant. And so when Matthew Brady took Lincoln's picture, what he did was he took a full profile so he could see the whole, the tallness, and he accentuated it, pinned his clothes down tight so they fit even better than the tailoring. Lifted the collar on his shirt so his neck didn't look so big and long, and had him put his hands on some books, which was, and he just puts his fingertips on the books. And if you look at the full photograph, you think it kind of says, I respect these books and I know what's in them. And this is a person who had no formal education at all. And as in the book, Team of Rivals, they point out that all of his cabinet were educated in the finest educations America could offer. And here he was self-educated, and he was able to manage this entire cabinet. So he's a very smart individual.
Well,
Thank
yes,
you.
obviously brilliant. Cathy, you're on? What would you like to ask?
Well, I was just looking at our questions from our audience, and you know, we have students on as well as adults and parents. We have some teachers. We have a student who asked a question that I think is probably worth addressing, and that is, he says, if Lincoln didn't want slavery, why didn't he just stop it when he became president? And why did they let it go on in the states where it was?
That's also a tough question. I mean, historians are arguing about that to this day. He had to win the war, be able to actually. By the way, that when they succeeded before his inauguration, that meant that they were not in Congress anymore. They weren't in the Senate. They had left. And so if they had passed a law freeing them, which they could, the Emancipation Proclamation did not exactly do that. But if they did, it would have no power over the the southern states anyway. So just making it illegal wasn't enough. They had to actually win the war, bring them back in the United States. Then they could pass amendments to the Constitution, which would make it illegal.
Right.
Dakare.
Mr. Best, I'm just here looking through the speech. And another thing that I had highlighted with a question mark beside it, he mentions, after he says that he's going to address the Southern people, he mentions Black Republicanism. Can you expound on that some more?
That was actually considered a slur by the slaveholding states about Republicans. So it was not considered a nice term. They called themselves radical Republicans, the ones that were for abolition completely, but they didn't call themselves Black Republicans. Their opponents did.
Okay, so Mr. Best, you wrote the book Tempest at Dawn, which was about writing this amazing document, the United States Constitution. Wonderful book. And talk to us about what Lincoln is saying here about the 21 founders that did not want to spread slavery, and the ones who didn't believe in slavery, you know, Hamilton and the rest of them. And this address, like correlate when they put, because he talks about in this address that even within the Constitution, they were making a point that they didn't believe in slavery. They didn't even use the word, but they had to negotiate themselves around this. But Lincoln talks about it in this address, and it seems what Lincoln's trying to say is, you know, they were in this position where they acknowledged slavery, but they didn't validate it. You know, they all wanted it to go away. They didn't validate it. But since you wrote the book about this process of writing the Constitution, what do you think Lincoln was reflecting on in regard to the construction of the Constitution in regard to slavery?
Well, there's an interest. First off, when he thought it was unfinished business, Lincoln did, and he admired all the founding fathers. He was very knowledgeable about the whole constitutional process and everything, but he idolized Washington. And he mentioned a couple times that he wished that there was something he could do as large as Washington, but the country was already born. Well, the unfinished business, of course, was slavery. That's, a lot of people thought that that was unfinished business from the convention. And so I think he took that on as his challenge to eliminate it. Now, in the Constitution, there are a number of things that you could say were had been given to the slaveholding states as a compromise, and a number of things against it. One was a $10 tax per slave, and the other was I think it was 1816 or something like that. There was a few years in the future that the Congress would have the power to stop all slave trade. And so there were things in there that were kind of danced around it. But I think the key thing you said, and is my strong belief, is they would not use the word slavery in the Constitution. And they danced around that term so much. To me, that means that they knew it was wrong. If they weren't able to even say the word and put it in there, even when they were referring to slavery, that tells me that they knew it was wrong. Now, the attitude at the convention about slavery was they thought it was dying. And it probably would have died except for Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And the South then moved from tobacco to cotton as a crop, and that made slavery still profitable again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Dakare, your turn.
So I'm just looking through the speech, of course, once again, and he says, "But you will break up the Union rather than submit to a denial of your constitutional rights." Can you talk about that?
Well, they didn't just succeed from the Union prior to the inauguration. They were broadcasting that they would. So there's a number of references in the speech where you threaten to break the Union, or can we forego our own principles because of threats to the Union. His little joke about a robber puts a gun to your head and says, hand over your money or I'll kill you and then you'll be a murderer. And so the breakup or the threat was a commonplace, almost everyday thing coming from the South at that time. And now you're going to have to ask me, what was the other part of the question?
It wasn't two-part. It was just
Oh.
it was just on what that specific quote was trying to say.
Could you repeat the quote for me?
Yeah, he said, but you will break up the Union rather than submit to a denial of your own constitutional rights.
Yeah, he had a whole series of arguments before that, which basically said that if you continue along this line of thinking, you're denying your own rights. And
yes,
so basically he was turning their own argument against them, but the threats were real and common at that point in time.
You know, it's interesting to read this address because it's so incredibly complicated. I mean, you know what?
Yeah.
It's not an easy address to decipher. You have to read it again and again and again. And to think that the audience was hearing this and that they all got it. You know, there was a standing ovation. And our politicians don't talk like this anymore. You know, they're not this the eloquent in their speech or the verbose. It's just they were completely different genre of speakers back then. You know, you hear Patrick Henry, they all get up and have, you know, speak for hours and hours and hours. But this this quote, here it is. He keeps saying, if y'all notice, it's kind of a modern day thing he was saying. He kept saying, "That is cool. That is cool."
Yeah.
Did you catch that, Dakare? Yeah. But as my daughter pointed out, he is not saying that is cool, like, hey, that's cool. He's saying it as if that is cruel, you know, cold, and it's cold. But I thought, wow, look at that. I can't believe he's saying that word, but he meant it in a different way. But here's what Dakare was talking about. A highway, well, no, actually, I don't think this is what someone mentioned this. A highwayman holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, "Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and you will be a murderer." So I'm going to kill you, but you will be the murderer. And then he goes to say, "To be sure," this is toward the end of his speech, "what the robber demanded of me, my money was my own, and I had a clear right to keep it, but it was no more my own than my vote is my own. And the threat of death to me to extort my money," and here's the correlation, "and the threat to the destruction to the Union to extort my vote can scarcely be distinguished in principle."
Exactly right. Yeah.
Sum that up for us, Mr. Best. I mean, I just read it, but I mean, he's saying
They were threatening that if you vote Republican, we're going to ruin the Union. And he's saying that that is an extortion of my vote, that I can vote any way I want. This is America. I vote privately. And if I were to give up and vote the way you want me to, just because of my fear, that would go against our principles. So he was suggesting that this wasn't any different than being robbed by being told you had to vote a certain way.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And you know what I read earlier about where the whole thing where Abraham Lincoln in his speech talks about the fact what the South was demanding. You have to say slavery's okay. You have to say slavery can go everywhere. You have to totally agree with what we agree with. And if you don't wholeheartedly 100% agree with what we agree with, then you're wrong and we're leaving and all that. So, but what's interesting to me about what the South was demanding in that particular paragraph in his, that I read earlier in this speech, is they're saying no freedom of speech for the North. You know, you have to say what we believe. You have to do what we believe. You have to take all this out of the newspaper. You have to say slavery is okay. You have to do this. And so they were denying, you know, the North or the rest of the country, the people that believe that slavery was wrong, a say, an expression, and freedom of speech.
Yes, and I think Lincoln even made a point in that speech where he said something along the lines that obviously we haven't done anything to you yet. All we're doing is preachers are talking about it. By the way, the day before this, he went to Cooper Union. He actually went to a church in Brooklyn that was, the pastor was Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, and met with him. And so, I mean, and obviously that was out there yelling. And so, yes, it ends up, and he makes, I think, a very good point, that it's a repression of speech, because they obviously hadn't done anything to the South about slaveholding yet. So they had only talked about it. And a lot of people did talk about it.
Yeah, Cathy.
We had a question from the audience that I was also wondering. You had mentioned a few minutes ago that there was a split in the Democrat Party. Can you explain just briefly why they were, what was the rift about within the Democrat Party? Was it slavery as well?
I wish I had boned up on that before this. I don't remember, but I know it was about slavery, and I know Stephen Douglas was the leader of the northern portion of the Democratic Party. I think it was the Deep South, or the slaveholding states, wanted a harder line taken even.
Okay.
Tova.
All right, so as I was reading through this speech, one thing that just really excited me is just how applicable it is to today, minus all the verbose language and, you know, obviously the discussions about slavery. It felt like there were a lot of sentiments and ideas that just seemed like could be given in a speech today. So I was wondering if you could talk about what lessons and ideas we can draw from this speech that we can apply to our modern day political situation or environment that we live in.
I think the major thing we can take away is that Lincoln's distilled that whole speech, comes down to the very end where he really brings it down to an issue of right or wrong. And so then he said, you got to stand on your principles, and might makes right, his closing sentence. And that I think one of the things that we can take away from this is that when we hear things, when politicians hear things from the other side that aren't accurate, he didn't rant and rave. He didn't go on Twitter, to my knowledge. Instead, he went to the research books and he looked up what all 39 of the signers of the Constitution did. And he came back with data and facts and tried to straighten out the record that he thought was made erroneously by Stephen Douglas. So I think that's some of it. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's one of the things we can take away from it, is that he was successful. I mean, he was able to accomplish his goals. And so that technique obviously was a successful strategy. Wouldn't
you love to see what Abraham Lincoln would say in 33 characters or whatever? It would be really fascinating. I mean, how he would have adapted to the times. I'm sure he would have. I'm sure he would have used Twitter. You know, unfortunately, in our society today, there's not the luxury of anyone wanting to listen to a speech like this anymore. I mean, that's the sad thing. I think that I greatly admire what Abraham Lincoln did. You were correct. He went back and proved to everybody with this whole thing that I've been talking about tonight, the 39 and then the 21 and the founding fathers that actually, signed documents that wanted to prohibit the advancement of slavery and what they all really believed and stood for. So he set up his case. And I think that that's one of the great things about this Cooper Union address. And it would be really fascinating to see what he would put on Twitter. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. Dakare, why don't you give the closing question, and then we'll see where we get. Go ahead, Dakare.
Hey, so it's me again. I am really fascinated with speech writers. I don't know why, but I've always been fascinated with them. Never wanted to be one, but just fascinated on how they do it. And speech writing didn't come into effect until the 20s. So I was wondering how you think that this speech would have been different if it would have been written by a speechwriter rather than coming from the heart and soul of President Abraham Lincoln.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, because they didn't use speechwriters back then. With the Gettysburg Address, he did pass that speech around to a lot of people and get their opinion on it before he delivered it. And he would tell people that he made some changes to it, so they felt like they had some ownership. But there are some historians who don't think he ever did make any changes. But they wrote their own speeches. And if you write your own speech, it does have to come from yourself. I mean, you're not projecting someone else's opinion. It's got to be your own. And I think the Lincoln-Douglas debates helped him become a better speaker and to write his own speeches, because they went from place to place all over the state of Illinois and had to pretty much do ad hoc kind of responses, and it was more in a traditional kind of debate standpoint. So I guess I would say I would love politicians to go back to writing their own speeches, or participating more, at least, in the writing of their speeches. Now they pick their speechwriters.
Wouldn't it be fascinating if we could see the Lincoln-Douglas debates on YouTube?
Yeah.
But it's kind of harkening back to the discussion tonight. It's really great that we have to go back and read them, because we can read them. There's a book, they have them documented, don't they, Mr. Best?
Yes, they do.
That would be an amazing book. That would be an amazing book to read as a series of those debates. Because when you read it, it's just, you underline, you make notes, and there are still surveys, polls, whatever you want to call it, out there where they've done that. They say you still learn best if you write things out. And there's just something that the brain seems to comprehend it a little more when you actually read it than if you see it on YouTube. It's just sort of a different genre, but it would be fun if we could see them on YouTube. Cathy, you want to close it? And Mr. Best, I just want to say you've been a trooper tonight with all of our challenging questions from the 16-year-olds.
Yes. Congratulations. Good questions.
Aren't they smart? We're so thrilled, and it's just a great joy that Dakare and Tova are so involved with Constituting America, as a lot of our past winners of our contest are, and the National Youth Board that Tova directs, and is because she's the director, and our ambassador here, Dakare. It's just a real joy. So I just want to say, Cathy, you can close us out, and Mr. Best, thank you so much. I know Tova and Dakare has some closing comments, but Mr. Best, you've been amazing. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed this.
Well, and
go ahead, Cathy.
I want to thank everybody for being on tonight, and just Mr. Best for your time. And if anyone wants to read the Lincoln's address at Cooper Union, you can go to our website, and right on the front page of our website is a little excerpt of Mr. Best's essay. Go ahead and click into his essay and scroll down, and we have Lincoln's actual address to Cooper Union hyperlinked near the bottom of his essay. So you can read both the essay and the actual address, and it would be well worth a read. I think y'all will find it fascinating. And I want to kick it over to Tova, and then I think Dakare has a couple of comments. Oh, I wanted one last thing though. When you leave, and please stay and listen to Tova and Dakare before you click off, but when you click off tonight, there will be a little link that comes up on your screen and asks you to take a short survey. If you could take that survey, that would help us measure our impact and just find out some of the things that you learned tonight. So we appreciate very much everyone participating with the survey. And I'll kick it over to Tova now.
Great, thank you, Cathy. So we just wanted to let you all know about our lineup for the upcoming week. So on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Janine, our wonderful Janine Turner, hosting the Founding Documents Forum, which this upcoming lesson is going to be focusing on checks and balances, which is obviously a very relevant topic with everything that's been happening. And then on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be having another constitutional chat with Janine, Cathy, Dakare, and I. We're going to be talking about the coronavirus and its effect on religion, movement, and election accessibility, which is even more relevant to the world around us. So please check that out and join us. And then next Saturday at the same time, 9 p.m. Eastern, we will, if you just can't get enough of Lincoln, we're going to be talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, which will be a really amazing discussion. So we hope to see you all there, and thank you for listening.
Go ahead, Dakare.
Your student ambassador, Cara Chapman. I want to thank everyone for being on tonight. Thank you, Mr. Bess, from all of us, as well as the Youth Advisory Board. I want to say thank you if there are any donors watching, and to all of our students out there, thank you. We hope that you're very inspired by our organization. And if you feel so inspired, please join our contest, our scholarship contest. And we have many different areas that you can submit in. Of course, I won the PSA and the short film. Tova's done the entrepreneurial, STEM, and PSA. So there are many different avenues that you can choose from. And we hope you enjoyed tonight, and we hope to see you guys again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Best, and thank you, Lisa, our Director of Communications, Lisa Williams. Say hi, Lisa.
Hello, thanks for coming.
All right, Mr. Best, thank you so much. We appreciate you. Let's all unmute to give him a big round of applause.
Woo!
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it so much. We'll see you on next Monday, Tuesday, or next Saturday. Have a great night.
Bye.